Documentary synopsis: the century-long struggle for freedom by domestic slaves in Igboland. In this documentary, we will explore the local campaign against indigenous slavery in Igboland. Many people think the British colonial government ended domestic slavery in Nigeria, but this is not true. In most African countries, there were local people who fought against slavery, yet few of these individuals are mentioned in history books. The Igbos, one of Nigeria's major ethnic groups, are primarily located in the southeastern region of the country. Known for their rich cultural heritage, the Igbo people are characterized by their vibrant traditions, festivals, music, and dance. The New Yam Festival and colorful masquerades are prominent features of Igbo culture, celebrating agricultural bounty and ancestral spirits. Despite facing challenges such as the Biafran War in the late 1960s, the Igbos have remained resilient, continuing to play a significant role in Nigeria's economic, political, and cultural landscape. The Igbos were significantly impacted by the transatlantic slave trade. During this period, many Igbos were captured and sold into slavery, transported across the Atlantic to the Americas. This era left deep scars on the community, with numerous Igbos enduring the brutal conditions of slavery. While the transatlantic slave trade is well known and heavily researched, a lesser known yet enduring form of domestic slavery existed in Igboland.
There are classes of slaves, those owned by idols, those owned by ordinary men, that we have to deal with them collectively.
Despite the presence of British colonial authorities in Nigeria from the early 20th century, domestic slavery was largely tolerated and in some cases encouraged by the colonial powers who needed free and cheap labor.
The British colonial government was not interested in the abolition of domestic slavery in Nigeria, especially in the Igbo part of Nigeria. Although they passed a law, an anti-slavery law, but this anti-slavery law was more for international audience to show that they are doing something about domestic slavery.
Within this system, there are two main types of slaves, the Ohu and the Osu.
This Igbo caste system, I don't call it Osu caste system, it's an Igbo caste system because all the Igbos are involved in it. Insofar as one side claims to be superior and makes the other side feel inferior.
In Igboland, the Ohu were slaves owned by individuals. These slaves could live with their masters and even marry, yet any children they had remained the property of their master. Remarkably, until the 1920s, slave owners retained the right to sell the children of their slaves at will. The Ohu were also subject to being used in human sacrifices. It was not uncommon for slaves to be sacrificed upon the death of a wealthy individual.
There was another one they called Umungbenye. People who were just there, they had no role in society, no position, except that when a big person dies from the privileged class, they will pick somebody from that divide and use that for ceremonies.
Nobody should be discriminated against on the basis of circumstances of death. You, me, nobody chose I will be born. We don't want discrimination so that the society can grow.
Furthermore, Ohu were barred from holding any local positions within the village and were effectively treated as mere livestock within the community.
The revolution I feel inside about this obnoxious custom is contrary to everything I believe as a Christian. We cannot all call God Father and treat others as outsiders and treat some as outsiders. Yeah. It is either or. Anybody who treats any other child of God as an outsider declares is not he himself or herself a child of God.
Conversely, the Osu in Igboland are slaves that belong to local gods. In those days, people could buy slaves and sacrifice them to local gods. The slave then became the property of the gods. As the property of the gods, they could also become a channel to the gods, similar to a monk.
Osu the way they practice it differ from community to community. Yeah, so in some communities, the ume there are children of incest relationship, or children that their first tooth came from the upper gum.
Individuals became Osu through a ritual of sacrifice to local deities, effectively making them the property of these spiritual entities. This status was also inherited. The child of an Osu automatically became an Osu. While the Osu were often despised by the general population, they were also feared. Due to their sacred association with the shrine, it was forbidden to harm them, providing them with a unique form of protection despite their marginalized status.
Actually, there used to be Ohuna and Amu in Nsukka. And in that situation, people don't marry really freely with each other.
People are aware of the Osu today because the stigma against them still exists, especially as many Igbos refuse to marry them.
Because of that belief that they are not social strata, they are not the same with you. You don't have their support. And out of that fear, nobody will agree to go contrary to the parents or the kinsmen position when it comes to marriage.
History. How did the Ohu slave gain their freedom? When the British pacified Igboland in the early 20th century, they introduced indirect rule.
Indirect rule. So indirect rule is the British needed local chiefs, local traditional rulers to rule over the people. And some of the local chiefs not just owned slaves, some of them were the biggest slave holders. And the British feared that mass emancipation of domestic slaves could threaten the position of local chiefs.
In Igboland, these local chiefs and elders often held significant control over domestic slaves. Another reason the British refused to abolish domestic slavery was that it provided them with a source of cheap labor crucial for the colonial economy.
They needed cheap labor for colonial projects, building roads, building infrastructure. Some of the local chiefs were the ones supplying the colonial states with labor. And the colonial state understood that proper abolition of domestic slavery would undermine not just the chief's position, but the ability to obtain cheap labor.
To tell the story of the Ohu slaves' revolt against the freeborn and the British colonial administration, we begin in 1909. In 1909, Albert Ernest Kitson discovered coal along the Udi Ridge in what is now Enugu State. This discovery of high-quality bituminous coal along the Enugu-Udi escarpment in Nigeria set high expectations for the colonial government. As a result of this discovery, they initiated the construction of two major projects. The first major project was the development of the coal mines.
They needed so much labor to do this, and so they relied on local chiefs who were some of the biggest domestic slave holders in the region to supply both the railway line and the coal mines with labor.
Coal mining operations began in early 1915 near the Obwedi River, with mining starting at Enugu Nengwo, known as the Udi Mine. By 1917, the Iva Valley mines were established and quickly became the primary source of coal. These mines were all located in what is now modern Enugu, approximately 150 miles from Old Calabar, the former capital of the Protectorate of the South, and about 50 miles from Onitsha on the Niger River port.
Interestingly, it was the coal mines and the Eastern Railway line that led to freedom for the Ohu slaves, especially in the northern part of Igboland, the Nkanu axis.
Before 1920, corrupt chiefs and the freeborn, known as Amadi, dominated the native courts and used colonial institutions to oppress the Ohu slaves. However, beginning in 1921-22, the Ohu slaves initiated an uprising that disrupted the established order in Nkanu. The native courts ceased to function effectively, leading to widespread conflict. Nkanu inspired other places in Igboland, and the Ohu slaves stood up to demand their freedom at Nsukka, Itiseta.
Although the British paid salaries to the slaves, these salaries were paid to or through the local chiefs. The local chiefs kept the salaries for many years. However, when the domestic slaves, when they got to the railway line and also to the coal mines, they encountered other workers from other regions, from Lagos, from Onitsha, from Owerri, more advanced region, if you like. And these domestic slaves learned from these more advanced workers. By advanced now I mean some of them have Western education, they have years of protests, and the domestic slaves, the Ohus, learned from these workers. And the militant disposition of some of the outsiders, especially the workers from Lagos.
Influenced by this exposure and the injustices they witnessed, the Ohu slaves learned from the other workers. By the time they returned to their villages, they were not just workers, but rebels ready to challenge the status quo. They no longer wanted to be slaves. They wanted to be free and were willing to fight for that freedom. For example, a 1920 report by the colonial district officer at Udi noted a significant shift in the social dynamics of returning laborers. Having been to the colliery and got numbers, have gone back to their towns and told the chief straight to his face that they are as good as he is and they will not be interfered with. This marked the genesis of the militant anti-slavery movement in northern Igboland, beginning in the Nkanu region. From the 1920s onward, the Ohu slaves in northern Igbo began to retain their wages for themselves, actively resisting the chief's attempts to seize them, and pursued freedom by all means necessary.
So this is how they took some of these militant ideas back to their villages. The first thing they did was to fight the local chiefs in order for them to start keeping their own wages.
In response, the freeborn opposed the freedom demands of the Ohu slaves. This opposition led to clashes and conflicts, resulting in numerous deaths. The struggle highlighted a deep-rooted tension between the striving for liberty by the Ohu slaves and the resistance by the freeborn, setting the stage for a protracted social upheaval. It's important to recognize that the conflict was not merely between the Ohu slaves and the Amadi freeborn. Notably, some freeborn individuals aligned themselves with the slaves. Indeed, several leaders of the Ohu movement were themselves freeborn. This cross-sectional alliance added complexity to the struggle and underscored a broader demand for systemic change within the Igbo society. See how the colonial government described the uprising. A general rising of the Ohu slaves against the Amadi is alleged to have been caused by the enlightenment gained by laborers working on the railway and colliery.
The colonial administration was ignorant of the nature of slavery in the Igbo region. In the Igbo region, domestic slavery has cultural and spiritual implications. So, for example, the Ohu slaves were not allowed to join titled society. They were not allowed to take titles, and title is a big deal in the Igbo region. Whenever a slave, an Ohu, becomes the oldest person, he will not be regarded as the Onyishi. Instead, the oldest freeborn will be regarded as the Onyishi.
This newfound financial and social empowerment meant that the traditional village masters could no longer restrain them, heralding a profound change in the social fabric of their communities. Here's how another British official described it. The present difficulty is due to erroneous idea inculcated in the slaves from colliery camps as to their being entitled to absolute freedom with all property rights.
So, for the Owo slaves, freedom meant the ability to join titled society, the ability to pass on their inheritance to their children, the ability to become the Onyeshe, the ability to dance Igede dance and to beat the Igede drum.
By December 1922, the colonial government took decisive action to quell the escalating conflict between the Ohu slaves and the freeborn in several villages, including Agbani, Oborka, Nara, Ihuakpara, Kerefi, Mburubu, Nome, Akpugo, Akporfu, Amagunzi, and Onachargu.
So the first thing they did was to send a police patrol to Nkanu. This is the Nkanu patrol. But the police patrol was not even enough. They had to make it a military patrol. So within 2 months, they added a platoon to the police patrol. So this military patrol stayed in Nkanu for almost a whole year, moving from one village to another village, settling disputes. This is dispute between the slave-born, the Ohu, and the freeborn.
Through the protest, the Ohu slaves achieved significant victories in their quest for freedom. They secured the right to ownership of their children, marking a crucial victory against oppressive practices. By 1925, in a move to shed the stigmatized identity, they declared that they no longer wished to be referred to as Ohu, and instead chose the name Albia. Building on these gains, by 1928, they began establishing free settlements, creating communities where they could live independently and with dignity, free from the constraints of their previous status. These developments were pivotal in transforming the social landscape and affirming the rights and humanity of the formerly enslaved populations.
Even though I'm not from what they may call the Osu people, I am from an area that they call the Omamos. Yeah. So, but I wasn't happy with that treatment, because to me, God created us all, and nobody decided where he would be born. The surprising thing is that I've seen that even education have not succeeded in removing it. Our religion, Christianity, we've been preaching, but it has not gone down deep into the hearts of people to deal with it.
The colonial government's failure to grasp these complex local dynamics meant that the freedoms granted were incomplete, and the legacy of slavery continued to affect the lives of the Ohu and their descendants.